Hi everybody. Searched the internet and I couldn't find a step-by-step on how to install the suspension on a small body AMC. I've got a 77 Gremlin here that I'm restoring, and I just refurbed all the suspension parts, put new ball joints and bushings and everything, was getting ready to put it back together. Thought I would do a step-by-step to show you how to do it. So I hate videos that talk for half an hour before they show you what they're supposed to be showing you, so we're going to get right into it. The first thing we're going to do, I've got the cross member already mounted under the engine. It's super easy. There's a stud and a nut on the front side and a bolt on the back side. You just bolt it in. It's very straightforward. That's what the lower control arm bolts to. But we're gonna start with the spring and the upper control arm. You kind of have to install them together. Otherwise, with everything else installed, it's really hard to get the spring in there. Also, I've got this tool that I bought off of eBay, which is a spring compressor. It's made specifically for small body AMCs. They also make them for Mustangs, other classic cars, but I've tried everything on these springs, and everything else other than this thing is really dangerous. They could slip off. That spring could really hurt you if you use something that doesn't work on it. These are great. It'll hold the spring in place. Even if it slips off of the mount, it's still not going anywhere. So I'll show you how to use this. What you do is the very first thing you need to do before you forget is take your spring bushing and install it in the car at the top. It would really suck to get all this done and then realize that you forgot your bushing at the top of the spring. So let's install that first. It just slides on. This one's from Prothane. I used all Prothane bushings instead of the factory rubber ones. A lot of people say the Prothane rides a little rougher, but they do last longer. This is going to be a car that doesn't get driven a whole lot, so I'm going with the Prothane. So anyway, first thing you do is install that. Second thing we'll do is take the spring in the correct orientation, and the correct orientation is the smaller coil goes to the top and the bottom coil goes to the bottom. And what we'll want to do is put this thing in the lower spring perch. And if you notice, the lower spring perch has two sides to it. One of them has a valley where the spring sits in. The other has a valley, but the valley's got to stop at the end of it. What you want to do is orient your spring the way it's going to sit in the spring perch, just like that, with the spring stopping at that spring stop. And then what we'll do from here is we'll install our spring compressor, and it's really easy to do. You take the end here that has the two studs, you stick it down into the spring like this. We'll go ahead and take the top off. And stick it down inside the spring perch, and on the bottom you'll put the nuts back on. I put these hand tight. You don't really want to leave them loose because there's, like I said, there's a lot of pressure on the spring, but you don't want them so tight that you can't get them off once you get the spring in the car. So I hand tighten them. Just like that. And gotta make sure your spring is seated on the spring perch like it's supposed to be. And then with the spring, the side of the spring perch that has the stop needs to go towards the engine side of the car. We're on the driver's side of the car here, so that's towards the engine side of the car. And then from here, you just stick this back up through the shock absorber hole, and make sure the top of the spring is settled into your upper spring perch, and then put the thrust bearing and the nut on the top of this and tighten it down hand tight. And we'll jump up top and I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so before I start tightening, I want to double check down here. I want to double check that my spring is sitting in the spring seat on the bottom, just like it's supposed to, which it is. You can see right up against the stop that the stop side of the spring perch is towards the motor. And then I want to check up top and make sure my spring is sitting right where it's supposed to be. It's real easy to get this thing off where it gets really small at the top, and it is. So everything's good. I'm ready to start tightening the nut at the top, which will compress the spring. And once I get it compressed enough that I can get the upper control arm in, then we'll do that. So here we go, back up top. Okay, this nut is 1 1/8 inch, I believe. 1 1/8 inch. And we just start tightening. You got to make sure that the whole mess down below doesn't rotate on you. It probably won't. The top of the spring in that spring seat should keep it where it needs to be. But it doesn't hurt to look down there every once in a while and make sure. Not sure exactly how many turns it takes to compress this thing the right way. Maybe you can count them on the video and let me know. But you'll want to compress it. You don't want to compress the spring all the way. That's unnecessary and dangerous. But compress it enough down below so that you can get the control arm on and the lower spring perch where it's supposed to be. We're almost there. That looks pretty good. All right, let's go downside. Take a look down there. Okay, let's take a look with our control arm. Kind of hand put it. You won't be able to place it exactly where it's supposed to go, but you can get it close and see if you can match up the holes in the lower spring perch, which we can. So I'll go ahead and push that up on there like that and put the nuts on the bottom side. These are 9/16 head. Put those on and tighten them up. We'll torque those down in a bit. But in the meantime, we can take our rubber mallet and see if we can get the control arm mounting to center over the holes where the bolts are supposed to go through. Before I brought the control arm over, I put the control arm in a vise and squeezed the bushings just to make sure that they're completely seated. These things fit really, really tight, and they're supposed to. So if they're, the slightest bit not completely pressed, it's going to be really hard getting them in the car, but I think I've got them where they need to be. When you hammer on the control arm, and by the way, the control arm is the same, both sides, right and left. Again, I'm using Prothane bushings in my control arm, and when you try to adjust the control arm into position, don't use a metal hammer. You'll just bend things up and it'll look terrible. You can use a rubber mallet like this. It works perfectly well, and instead of hitting it straight on, I've discovered if you hit it on the side and try and wedge it into place, that really works best. So, yeah, you can see moving really well right there. So let me get it close to where it needs to be. Yep. Looks like I've got it pretty well lined up. Let's go back up top again and take a look. Okay, not sure if you can see this or not, but it's really close. It's close to where it needs to be. But still, it's going to be really hard. These bolts don't want to go in there, and you don't want to mess up the threads. So what I did was made a tool like this out of a 1/2 inch bolt, and I tapered the end on a grinder so that you can put this in here, hammer it in, and it'll bring your bushing around to where it needs to be. And And you can screw it back out. Enough to get some pliers on it. You can hit it with your mallet and get it right out of there. So now you can put your bolt in. You put it in from the inside out. The nut goes on the outside. You run it through. Then tap it on the rest of the way. And screw it on in. You put your washer and your nut on the outside, and we're not going to tighten this down because you don't want to tighten the control arm in this place until you get the car sitting down on the ground. Then we'll go back and around and tighten these things. Now I'm going to do this back hole the same way I did the front, and then we'll have the upper control arm mounted. I'll be back as soon as I do that. Put the suspension bumper on because it's hard to get to after the fact, and it just goes on with 3 bolts. The head is looks like a 1/2 inch head. Go. Okay, before we let the spring compressor down, we're going to go ahead and install our lower control arm. These are the same right and left. I put new ball joints in mine and new prothane bushings, and again I put it in the vise and squeeze the bushing down a little bit so we can make sure to get it in the hole. These aren't generally as hard to do as the upper ones, but they mount in the holes in the cross member. And the hole on this side, well, actually on both sides, has a little piece of angle iron there. And what that does, here's the bolt with an oblong, I don't know, off-center looking washer made onto it, and that's what helps adjust the suspension once you get this thing in. So this is another bolt that we want to put in and hand tighten. We don't want to tighten it up completely until we align the front end. It's got a bolt like this and then a washer that goes on the other end that has a flat spot on it, so it only goes on the bolt one way, so you can't mess that up. And I believe it's a 7/8 head on this end and a 13/16 on the nut end, and the nut is tapered. You want to make sure and put it on with the flat side towards the bolt. So first thing we do is see if we can get the control arm up where it's supposed to be and centered. You can generally do this by hand. You can get it close. Again, use the rubber mallet instead of a metal hammer. You won't tear things up. Use the tool that I made for the top to center these, but you generally don't have to. They're pretty easy to get into place. And make sure that bolt flattens out in that hole. Make sure it goes all the way in there, just like that, where the washer's riding on that angle. And then you put the washer on the back side, same way. Put your nut on flat side first. And we'll tighten this, maybe not hand tight, but maybe not completely tight either. There we go. And now our lower control arm's on. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the strut rod bracket on the back side. And what we've got here, this is on the driver's side. On this particular model, there are heat shields that bolt to it, and those are kind of tricky to get on there the right way. Here's the correct way, whoops, to get those installed if you want to freeze the frame and take a look at that. But this will mount towards the back side of the frame rail here where it dips back down. There's a stud mounted in the frame rail, and then and there's a nut that goes on that, and then there are these two long bolts and nuts that go on as well with washers. One of them with the washer goes in through this hole sideways and pokes out on the inside just like that, and this other one goes through the top of the frame rail and comes down into this hole right here. I'll step up there and insert this bolt really quickly. Since the frame rail is curved and you've got two different bolts coming at two different directions, you won't be able to put them both in at the same time on the bracket. So what you want to do is install the stud first, and you'll duck this long piece of the bracket on the inside of the frame rail. This one will lay flat up against where the screw is coming through on this side, and you'll want to put that stud right there where it belongs and put the nut on it. Just hand tight. There we go. And now you should be able to push these other two through to where they belong. All the nuts and bolts in place. And well, these two nuts and bolts are 5/8. You might need help. Get somebody on the other side to help you tighten these. And the stud nut is 11/16. Once you get them in place, you can tighten them down. Alright, let's go ahead and install our torsion bar. Here's the way it goes in the car. This is the driver's side, and you can tell it's got a little pitch. The back of the torsion bar kind of goes up a little bit, and this pitch is where it mounts to the lower control arm, and you can see it's kind of curved like a hockey stick. It has this little point here on it, and the purpose this serves is so that you know you've got it on the right side. If you put this on your control arm and that point contacts your ball joint and doesn't let you bolt this thing down correctly, then you've got it on the wrong side. So you'll want to make sure that the point points inboard on the car towards the engine. So it pitches up at the end and the point goes inboard. So what we're going to do first is we're going to put some of our hardware down on the end and mount it into the rear mount that we just installed first. So here's the hardware that's used to install it, and this goes in order on the end of the torsion bar. There's a thick nut and then a concave washer, and they are stamped as to which side goes to the front of the car and which side goes to the rubber. So be sure and put them on the correct way. The original bushings on the car use these split collars, these collars like this, and one is shorter than the other. The shorter one goes towards the front of the car, longer one goes towards the back. The bracket goes right here in between and the bushings, but since I'm using the Prothane bushings, we're not using those. What we are using are the Prothane bushings, and there's a single collar that goes inside of those. Makes it a little easier. So this is the way we're going to mount this. Then there's another washer. It's a smaller one, and again it's printed as to which side goes to the rubber. It does not cup the rubber. It lays against the rubber like this, and be sure and pay attention to the stampings on here. Then there's a large nut to the outside, and then there's a thinner nut that's a lock nut to that that I can't find right now, but you got to have that on there to make sure that your settings don't back off once you get everything set in place. So I'm going to go ahead and put this part of the assembly onto the end of my torsion bar, and then that way we can put it through the hole in the bracket and then do the back side. So be back after I've done that. Okay, this is how that goes. You'll want to thread the nut down to where it's within about 1 inch of the end, and then put your washer on the correct way, bushing on the correct way, and the sleeve in the middle, and stick it through the hole. Then put the other bushing and washer and nut on the other side. Okay, now that you've got that in there, loosely, of course, you'll bring the control arm up and you'll make sure your pointy end is facing inside, and you'll take these bolts through the ball joint holes. You may have to push the control arm up a little bit, and you'll put them in from the top to the bottom. There we go. Just like that. And the lock nuts on the bottom. And these are 9/16 head bolts and 1/2 inch head lock nuts. And you'll want to go ahead and tighten those down. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do, suspension wise, is put our knuckle on. And you'll take off these ball joint nuts, and here's the knuckle. They are the same right and left. The only thing you need to remember is the 4 holes go towards the bottom. The long neck goes to the top, and it doesn't really matter how you orient it right now. We're gonna, when we put the brake stuff on, we'll put it the right way, but just slip it over the ball joint studs, just like that. Come on. Here we go. And put the nuts on. You'll want to torque those down to the correct specifications, and then put the pins, there are holes in the ball joint studs and slots in the nuts that go on them, and you'll want to align those where you can put a pin through, bend it over on the other side. Now we get to install the shock absorber, and we're done with the suspension. So the shock looks like this. The bottom pegs go in where the spring compressor is on the coil spring mount, and the top goes through the hole up top. So okay, now it's time to take our spring compressor loose, and you just loosen it by hand just like you did tightening it. Loosen up just like that. We'll take all that off. Then we're in good shape. We'll take off our upper spring mount. take that off. Now we go to the bottom and take the nuts off of the bottom of the compressor. Okay, there we go. I took off the lower mounting screws by hand because we only hand tighten them, and this will pull right on out. Done deal. Now we'll do our shock absorber. You'll do the top, put the bushing on the top. We've got a washer and a bushing, and on the bottom there are two little rubber bumpers, and you'll put it down into the same holes that you had the spring compressor attached to, and stick it down in there just like that. We'll put our upper shock mount on, get it centered in the hole. We should be able to push that down and put our nuts back into place and our bolts. Tighten those down. Great. Then we'll want to put our upper bushing, make sure that's still centered. Put our upper bushing on and washer and nut. And this, I believe, is a 5/8. Yes, it is. We'll tighten this down. Just get it snug. And now we'll go to the bottom and put the bottom on. Okay, and like I said, our studs are sticking through to the bottom. I don't know if you can see them or not. They're all black, so probably blends in. Our studs are sticking through the lower coil spring mount, so we'll want to put a rubber bushing and a washer and a nut on each side. Go. Tighten that down until the rubber starts bulging out. Do the front, the back. The shock is installed and our suspension is done. So that's it for this video. Join me for the next video where we'll put all of the brake stuff on the backing plate and the hub and rotor and caliper and all that stuff. So we'll do that next time. If you have any questions, please put them in comments. I'll see if I can answer them for you. Otherwise, we'll see you on the next video.